Hi, I'm V.S. Holmes. Thank you so much for joining me in the Toadstool Bookstore for this virtual signing, and I'm so appreciative of all your flexibility as we navigated how to have a signing, given the current circumstances. So thank you for that as well. Today I am going to be talking a little bit about Blood and Mercy, which is the final book in my Reforged series. It's epic fantasy, and it released at the end of June, so I'm really excited to share the end of this journey with you. It's been so incredible. I'm so touched by all of the support that everyone's given me, and just incredibly honored by the awards the series has received. So thank you so much. Just to give you a little taste before we dive in, I'm going to read the back description for you. Saving the world has doomed them all. Kepler reels in the wake of grief and guilt at the blood on his hands. Outside the city walls, however, winter grows fiercer and droughts longer. Alia reforged the fractured world 20 years before. So why is it withering before his eyes? Then, just as he masters being a monarch, a prophet arrives spouting scripture about a one true God. Kepler's own mother killed the last gods, yet this one matches his description perfectly, and its wrath is about to fall upon Atherlon. Isolated within the same cold marble walls as Atherlon's murderous king, Ree struggles to plot her rebellion leagues away from everything she has ever known. With an unexpected ally, she may have finally found a way to the American Hetmere, until tragedy strikes. With religious fanatics at their walls, blight in their fields, and a king floundering from addiction, Atherlon spirals out of control. Now Ree must choose between a mad king's life and her own revolution. I'll give you a little background on the world. It takes place within the Blood of Titans world. It's an epic fantasy, and I wanted to explore a little bit what happens when heroes are imperfect and maybe they're as broken as the world that they're trying to save, and what happens when you wake up and your entire world is changed. My very initial inspiration for the original story that I wrote when I was 12, it's changed a lot since then, thankfully, is this picture of a ruined city in the desert that I found in National Geographic. And I was just drawn to this image and the idea of waking up and your home being gone. I think that uprooted feeling is something that a lot of us can relate to in some form or another. And Blood of Mercy in particular, and the latter half of the series, I wanted to explore what happens to heroes and our perception of them in the aftermath of battle and of war. Particularly as the world changes and doesn't need those heroes anymore, doesn't need different heroes. I think that's something that has always been interesting to me, especially since our world changes so quickly, as we're all quickly finding out. I also wanted to touch on having disabled protagonists and queer protagonists. As a disabled queer person myself, I think representation, especially in fiction and in sci-fi fantasy, in these worlds that we are imagining, is incredibly important. Blood and Mercy, in particular, has a deaf protagonist and a pansexual protagonist, as well as many other supporting characters of various spectrums under the rainbow. And I'm just really, really excited to finally be able to share these characters' journey with you. So I'm going to do a quick reading from the beginning of Blood and Mercy. Don't worry, there aren't too many spoilers. So I'll just begin. Fog still clung to the stone, allowing the sleepy night and seedy activity to continue a few hours later than usual. Hylier shrugged into his jacket, wishing briefly for the old-fashioned cloaks he grew up wearing. Jackets were more practical, but nothing beat the dampness of the city, better than being wrapped in thick wool. In a decade, they might have silk-lined coats and horsehair decorations from Bonn. A crowd stalled his hurried steps as he turned a corner to the Lily and Alphonse. Guards swarmed around a fountain, one that was a popular gathering spot for the dandies and flirts of the Silver Apron. Someone had shut the fountain's valve, and the basin looked as if filled with wine. The sickly smell of sweet blood hit him as he shouldered through the crowd. Murder in the streets was nothing new. One look at the man's face told Hylier this was no murder. This was a message. Back, I've had enough of you sick gawkers. Hylier flashed the emblem on his chest. King's Guard. It was not truthful, exactly, but it was the best excuse he and Kepler had chosen for the occasions he would need one. The man peered at the sigil. Sorry, sir, had too many trying to make a name for themselves. He heaved a sigh, pulling a stylus from the damp wrap around his head to make a note on the wax tablet in his hand. Inspector Gretton. Been following Perron for some time now. Didn't expect to see him bloated in the square this morning. Understood. Hylier rolled his shoulders back. He did not have to fake the concern on his face. This man was connected to crimes against the crown. Private information, of course. I'm just reporting to His Majesty. Hylier wasn't a spy, not in the conventional sense. He just knew people, fell into easy conversations, and was forgotten, other than a vague sense of friendliness. A journeyman inspector would glean more from the scene than he, but as he ought to bring something back, some report, an enemy of my enemy isn't always my friend. You think it was a mugging? Gretton snorted. Bag's missing, and he was an affluent man. You have a minute to take a look, just don't disturb anything. Hylier thanked him and stepped closer to peer at the body. It was hard to tell what would be missing, but Perron was rarely without his drink, especially in the evening. Have you any thoughts on the matter? Looks like an argument gone foul. Clearly tensions were high. Just look at the man's throat. Hylier crouched, taking care to touch nothing, save the fountain's rim to steady himself. What throat? Windpipe was crushed, gleaming shards of bone jutting from where the thin U-shaped bone ought to be. The rest of the flesh was gnarled and torn free. Several pieces bobbed in the bloody fountain. He had never liked Perron. The man was not likable, even from a fanatic supporter standpoint. Hylier lifted the edge of the man's coat. Spilled purse, no pack or writing kit. I think I have all I need. See to it that the palace guard gets a writ of everything you find. Gretton seemed to speak in sighs. I'll have it to you in 3 days. We're barely through with all the murder and looting that happened during the unrest. But I'll see it done, sir. Thank you, Hylier answered, slipping back into the crowd. Unrest. It was a sanitary term for tearing oneself apart. It was how his stomach felt now that danger weighed it, now that murder ran rampant. Was this simply cleaning up after letting the fanatic snip loose ends? Before he knew it, his boots brought him to Keplin's door. He wished he could just return to bed. Perhaps if he did, the day would begin with something other than murder and madmen. Instead, he took a moment on the bench between the regent's chambers and Keplin's. A breath, and another. Later, he would go to the training halls and force his anxiety from his body with sweat and exhaustion. First, however, he had to explain how the Perron situation had grown suddenly more complicated. He awake? He asked the guard outside the king's door. I heard him rattling around early this morning. Shift before mine said he came back late, looking like death. Though it's hard to say if he ever doesn't, begging your pardon. I'd keep that thought amongst yourselves, Hylier commented. I'd like to see him. It's about his safety. Cold air drifted out when the door swung open. Hylier frowned and shut the door behind him. Your Majesty, it's Captain Hylier. Study, the rasped answer drifted from a half-open door. The walls were bare of every portrait, only the landscapes remaining. The paintings were stacked in a corner, covered by a moldering cloak. Hylier's hackles rose. The double doors of the king's bedroom were open, as were those to the balcony. He nudged the study door open to see Keplin seated at his desk, bare feet propped on the top, smudging what looked like official Bana scrolls. This was the only hearth that was lit, and the sullen fire did little to counter the early morning draft. Keplin's hair was lank, the kind of greasy that came from too long in hot water. His clothes were pressed and fresh, but the deep bags under his colorless eyes spoke of a sleepless night. His body trembled, alert despite the clear lines of exhaustion. The guard was right. He looked like death. You've not been sleeping? I hired you to listen, not gossip with guards. You hired me to keep you safe, sire, Hylier reminded. It was a stretch of the truth, but not one Keplin could really argue with, he hoped. There have been some developments with your friend's murder. The network of spies and soldiers who wanted Daimir on the throne is alive and well, quieted by peace but not converted. You asked me to find out more, and I found a list. Your cousin's name is on there, Asimir. It's a bold network that would attack an ambassador's son in his own home, and they were very nearly successful. And I'm concerned they'll try for you next. Keplin barely moved. Lord Asimir is safe. I would have heard it sooner if he weren't, Keplin noted. It was callous, even for him. Perhaps shock would rouse the man's concern. Perron is dead. Keplin's gaze wavered, but not to Hylier with curiosity. Instead, his eyes flicked to the hearth and back. Fire smoldered there, reluctant to catch on the damp scrap of fabric. Hylier bent closer. It was a sleeve, decorated, and Keplin's size. Whatever drenched it was acrid and red. Had Hylier not seen the fountain, he might have thought it wine. Dates. Thank you so much for listening to that little excerpt. I hope that it piqued your curiosity about the events that happen in Blood and Mercy. I'm going to dive into some of the questions now. I received so many great ones, and I'm just going to kind of brush on the most common themes here. There were a lot about disability representation and sort of where I'm going with the series, so hopefully some of those will be answered. And definitely, again, feel free to comment down below, and I'll answer those as well. Paul asks, do you think disabled representation has changed in the time you've been a writer? Has that affected what you've written? So short answer, yes, it has definitely changed, mostly for the better. Like a lot of marginalized representations, we see a fair amount of stories being written from outside of the community, with varying degrees of success. I think a lot of people are pushing now for own voices work, which is always best. I've definitely seen that since I started this journey. When I first started writing Reforged, I myself wasn't disabled. And, as it happens, you're not always aware of writing certain representations, and I realized as my own disability and condition progressed that I really wanted to see characters, especially in fantasy, that was, like my wheelhouse. I wanted to see characters who looked like me, and who might not be able to lift a sword, or take those long journeys, to Mount Doom. So it's definitely changed. My focus has also changed as I've written this series, because the first book, Smoke and Rain, came out, it was the very first book that I ever wrote, and I was still unfamiliar with what I could write. I hadn't seen a lot of books with people who looked or acted or loved like I do, and, when you're younger, you don't realize, well, maybe it's up to me now. And I've definitely been able to find so many other writers who are working on this, and they're so skilled, and they have so many amazing worlds, and I just hope that it continues to progress that way. So the next question is from Marissa. I would love to know if you are working on other fantasy titles in the Blood of Titans universe. Yes, I am. It's such a big world, and spans a huge amount of time, and I'm really looking forward to exploring both before and after this particular arc. What I'm currently focusing on is the two books that follow the events of Blood and Mercy. It's a couple years later, and a few of the side characters are explored in that series. I'm really excited to write it because it's delving a little bit more into flintlock fantasy. It's a bit more industrial. There are steam engines, there are firearms to some extent, and I'm really, really excited to kind of combine that with the magic of the world. So definitely exploring that. I also have some prequel books planned, also to sort of explore some of our heroes and anti-heroes from this particular series, and sort of their origin stories, right? So I'll definitely be looking for those in the next few years. The next question is from Ariel. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you like/don't like about current queer and disabled representation in sci-fi fantasy, and any other books and authors who have influenced your writing in those areas. That's a great question. There are a lot of tropes that I'm not a huge fan of, as far as disability and queer goes. I'm going to focus on disability first. My probably least favorite is the disabled villain trope, the classic, like, oh, he's got a scar, so he's the bad guy thing. I just feel like it adds a really insidious layer of morality to being disabled. And I explored that recently in an essay that I wrote for Sirens, so I can link that below once that goes live. I also don't like the disability being a cost that one pays for power. This is a very old trope. We've seen it with Odin, even in the Norse myths. He gave up an eye for wisdom, and that too frames disability as a negative thing, and it's not always. what society chooses to do with disabled is, but that's just in general. In and of itself, disability is not a negative. Another trope that I really don't like is the magical cure, because again, it goes into like, oh, if you're good, if you save the world, if you do the thing, then you get to be cured, and it's a reward. And a lot of us don't necessarily want a cure. We would much prefer the world to be more accessible to us. And while I'd like to not be in pain every day, being unable to walk as easily as I used to isn't something that I need cured. I just would prefer to have the world be more open to me. So yeah, those are probably my top three least favorite tropes. But again, just sort of to touch on the second half of your question, there are a lot of authors who are subverting these tropes in really creative ways. There are always ways to write things in a way that acknowledges them and acknowledges the history behind them, in all marginalizations and in all stories. So there's definitely a lot of work out there. I have a couple of resources on my website, so you can check out some other authors who are doing great work. And again, a lot of my work with sirens touches on this, so definitely check that out as well. Let's see. The next question is from Angela Breen. I would like to know more about your current project. So I'm a multi-project author. I always have multiple things going on at once, usually in different stages of often disarray, while I try to be organized. So what I'm currently working on is the fourth book in my Nell Bentley series, it's a sci-fi series. It's much more fast-paced. If you are interested in lesbian archaeologists in space, that is the series for you, as long as you don't mind foul tempers and more foul language. Definitely check those out. So I'm working on the fifth book, Heretics, which comes out this October. I'm very excited to continue Nell's journey. She's very close to my heart. And the other project I'm working on is a sort of super secret project. I'm not quite at liberty to share all of it, but just think dark, brooding, necromancy, lots of death and sex. And it's just unlike anything I've ever written before, and I cannot wait to eventually share that with the world once it's done cooking, so to speak. I am also working on outlining some of the next books in the Blood of Titans world, so those are my multiple projects going on right now. If you want to know a little bit more, you can check out my website, and you can also sign up for updates from my newsletter, and you get all of that information first. So definitely, if that's what is interesting to you, check that out. The next question is from Olivia. I'd love any nonfiction book recommendations you've got on how the concepts of health and different abilities have evolved and where we can go from here. Also, have you got any ideas for resources a disabled person can use when they just want to hand someone an infographic rather than putting in the labor of explaining all the details? Yeah. So that's a really complex question, so I'm just going to touch on a little bit about it. Nonfiction book recs. There's definitely a lot of really incredible books out there. When looking for them, make sure you're finding an author who themselves is disabled. There are a lot of books written by caregivers or family members who have someone in their life that's disabled, and while some of those are great and well written, a lot of them are pretty problematic, so I'd steer away from those. Right off the top of my head, I know Shane Burka writes some really cool things. He himself is disabled, and he writes specifically a lot about being in a relationship as a disabled person with someone who is not disabled. He has a lot of really cool resources, and I also believe he has a YouTube channel. If so, I can link that also below. So definitely maybe check out his stuff, but honestly the best resource I've found for learning both about my own condition, because things vary and doctors aren't always all-knowing, and also for people who don't have disabilities, is listening to people who do. I found Twitter to be an incredible community, and you can just kind of tune in and just listen. that sort of touches on the infographic thing. Definitely, I think a lot of people have questions, especially as they're trying to educate themselves. And being able to find a community where they have all these resources, where other people have compiled these amazing lists of books, of healthcare things, of any legal stuff that you might have to navigate. There are some really great communities out there, especially on Twitter. There's no one big catch-all because everyone's disability is different, and even within one disability or marginalization, if we're talking about queer rep as well, no one has the same experience. There might be similarities, but there's no one overarching monolithic experience. And that's why I think there aren't as many resources, because all of our lives have varied so much. So definitely that's sort of a quick primer on where to go, and definitely just listen to the people within your community, and be ready to tackle some of the discomfort you might feel with realizing, like, oh, I thought this one thing, and now I realize that that's not the case. So definitely start there. So the next question is from Jay. Tell me about designing grand wars and battle scenes. So that's a fun one. I touched a little bit on how I tackle war in this series, but as far as the grand battles go, when I was writing the final iteration of Smoke and Rain, I was also taking a military history course in university, and it delved into the politics and machinations behind war in a way that I hadn't really heard before. And also the teacher was incredibly passionate about the topic, so that helps. And I really got into all of the tiny little things that happen behind the scenes of these great cataclysmic battles that we see in so many fantasy books. And to me that was more interesting, because battles only take a few minutes. Even sieges, while they might last months, the actual firefights or sword fights are very brief, just little skirmishes. And what really wins wars isn't necessarily those battles, but all of the incredible complex things that are going on behind the scenes. And there's a lot of waiting, there's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of verbal sparring before anyone even draws a sword. And I wanted to really showcase both, because while in fantasy we love these huge explosions, there's lightning coming from the sky, there's fire, there's oceans being dredged, I also wanted to touch on the human aspects of it, because those are the things that we're going to encounter in our own world. And I've always felt that fiction is a great way to explore our own history, but also what we want for the future. So I hope that answered your question, Jay. So my final question is from Brad. I was interested in the gap in time between lightning and flames and madness and gods. Was it hard to figure out how some of these legends could disappear for so long? So partially yes. The series was originally written as 2 books. So Smoke and Rain and Lightning and Flames were originally a single book, and then Madness and Gods and Blood and Mercy were the second one. And while there is that gap in time, and the 2 halves can definitely sort of be read separately, I think there's a lot to be gained from reading them in order. And it was difficult to figure out what I wanted to happen with these characters, particularly as I was kind of delving into what happens with these heroes after battle, because we really do see a lot of, okay, here's this huge battle, we've won, okay, everything's great, then now what? And I wanted to touch on when you've seen these horrific things or done these horrific things, even perhaps in the name of the greater good, what do you do after that? How can you possibly recover and sort of marry this person who you were and had to become with the life that you want now, and the peace and tranquility, or just, maybe some quiet. And I really thought that was important to explore with these characters, because they were thrown into this really violent world and now they have the chance to kind of recover from it, but can you really recover when there is so much that is either left unsaid or undone, and your entire identity has been built around this hero? So it was definitely something I wanted to focus on. It was difficult to figure out how to deal with that in a genre that really loves to focus on how heroic these heroes are. So I hope that answered your question. I think that's the last question I have. Again, feel free to leave more. I can't wait to see what you guys think of this series. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on how it ended, and what ultimately happens to these various characters. And I also am really excited to share with you the rest of the journey as I keep going in this world. If you're interested in checking out the Reforged series, make sure you buy your paperbacks through the Toadstool bookstore at toadbooks.com. And you can also check out some digital copies at my website, which is www.vsholmes.com. And you can find box sets on there as well. And but if you do order a paperback through Toadstool, you will be getting a signed copy from me. If you want a taste of the world before you commit, you can go to vsholmes.com/tempest to download a free copy of a short story that takes place within the Blood of Titans world about 200 years before Smoke and Rain. And it sort of follows this survival story of a young woman who is undergoing a trial by Ocean and Leviathan for the crown of Warlord in her kingdom. And I had a lot of fun writing that one, and it just gives you a little bit of the scope that this world has. So definitely check that out if you'd like to. Of course, I want to thank Toadstool Bookstore for helping host this, and being flexible as we figure out how to have this virtual signing, and just continually supporting me. It's the bookstore I went to as a child, and it's so incredible to be able to work with them now as an author. And they're just, support your indie bookstores, guys. They're so wonderful. And also thank you for being here, asking your questions, and supporting me. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. If you want to know a little bit more about the authors that I'm reading and talking with, you can check out my podcast at podcast.amphibianpress.online. I do all sorts of author interviews, mostly sci-fi, fantasy, some horror and thriller and romance thrown in there too. And we release a new episode every Wednesday, and you'll find some incredible authors on there, many of whom I'm currently reading, though my to-be-read pile is towering and threatening to crush me. So definitely check that out if podcasts are your thing. So thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope you all stay safe.